Hello, everyone. This is Lucian Vulsan with the Freedom Alternative, and as I promised to some of the fans, I'm here with Professor Janice Fiamengo for the third time in the history of this channel, but over a year since the last time we spoke. Greetings,
That's
Professor
right.
Fiamengo.
Greetings to you, Lucian. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. It's just that my schedule has gotten incredibly insane. As some of our colleagues in the counter-feminist group are preparing to go to Australia, I'm preparing to go in the middle of the feminist insanity. I'm going to Sweden
Wow.
for almost 2 weeks. Yes, and I'm going there to document the insanity. And so because I'm going to go there, I have to fix everything here and leave everything in order before I leave. So
Hmm.
that means an incredibly insane schedule.
Oh,
Anyway,
yeah.
um, so since we've spoke last time, a lot of things have happened, haven't they? I mean,
Hmm.
last time we spoke, Trump was a distant hope.
Yeah.
Last time we spoke, the ICMI 16 hadn't happened, whereas
Hmm.
now ICMI 17 is going to happen within a week or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, lots of things
Hmm.
have happened.
Yes.
So let's try to keep a certain amount of order. Um, Last time we spoke, we were getting ready to. You were still collecting submissions for your book, Sons of
Hmm.
Feminism. Now the deadline for that has long passed. When is the book coming out?
I don't have a deadline yet. I'm still not absolutely certain whether it's going to be published by a professional publisher or whether I'm going to self-publish it. I suspect I'm going to self-publish it. I was in conversation with a large American publisher, and in the end, it didn't work out. And I'm not sure that I want to wait because it always involves quite a lot of delay. You know, you have to send the manuscript and you wait a long time and then they finally get back to you. And so I think I'm probably going to go the self-publishing route. I'm a little bit worried about that because I don't know, whether that's going to significantly impact the distribution and advertising for the book, and whether it will mean that not that many people hear about it. Of course, I would like it to have the widest possible distribution. But I also want to get it out. I think now is sort of the time. I want to kind of ride on the coattails of the red pill a little bit. Not that I expect my book is going to have that same sort of impact, but I think now is the time when there is kind of growing pushback. I'm not one of those hopeful people who thinks we're at the turning of the tides by any means, but I think more and more people are kind of interested in hearing about critiques of feminism and hearing about men's experiences. And so anyway, so I think, yeah, I hope that by the end of the summer at the latest, the book will be published. And I'll be, of course, trumpeting that fact on Studio Brule channel and any other opportunity that I get. And what I can say for sure is that it's a really fantastic book. And in fact, I'm going to have to create a second volume because I ended up getting so many fantastic submissions that I couldn't include them all in one book. And the book that I've got right now has, I think, 28 personal essays. And I had to make terrible choices to leave out all sorts of fantastic essays. So I've got enough for a second volume. And if I go the self-publishing route, there's absolutely no reason why I can't publish the second volume as well. And I think people will be really interested. They're a whole range of narratives, some quite personal, some more kind of analytical, some directly talking about how feminist policies and feminist institutions impact men's lives, some just talking about generally men reassessing what it means to be male in a feminist culture. One man, for instance, talking about how the attempted suicide of his father made him rethink the way his whole family's ideas of masculinity and femininity had led up to a situation in which his father felt that his only escape was to try to kill himself, things like that. And it's I'm really excited about it. I think it's a fantastic book, and I'm so grateful to so many men for sending me their stories.
Well, 5 minutes into the interview, and we already know when we're going to have you next time on this channel after the book comes out.
That would be very nice. That would be nice. Yeah,
Yeah, of
thank you.
course.
I'd love that.
And after I read it, so I get to ask you questions from the book.
Hmm.
Sticking on the topic of books, you recently announced on your social media profile, I think it was on Facebook, that you're already working at another book.
Yeah,
Your working title, I think, is "What Privilege: Academic Feminism and the War on Men," or something like that.
that's
Tell
it.
us a
Perfect.
tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, well, that one I've been thinking about for a long time, and then I finally kicked myself in the rear end and said I've got to get started. I've only got 3 months left before the school term starts up again, so I'm going to try to work on that every single day. I'm going to try to go dark on social media to a certain extent, because of course, as we know, you can spend your whole day on Facebook and have all sorts of really interesting conversations and get nothing done at the end. So yeah, it's going to be a kind of expanded, select um, collection of Fiamengo file scripts, but revised to be read, updated, and elaborated upon. And what I mean, I feel I don't really have anything new to say about feminism. In a way, it's if one is interested in a critique of everything that's wrong with feminism, you can't do better than Christina Hoff Sommers' book, Who Stole Feminism. That's still relevant, even though it was written way back in the, I can't remember now, early 90s, late 80s. Is
92.
long, 92.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a long time ago, and yet everything she says there, it has just continued. It's amazing, really. She debunked all of the statistics, all of the claims, and showed exactly why everything about the institutional reality of feminism is damaging to both men and women, and yet it's just continued on, at an accelerated pace. But anyway, and also, if anyone has read Daphne Patai's books, her book Heterophobia, Sexual Harassment and the Future of Feminism, again, an old book. I think it came out in, again, the early or late 90s maybe, but still absolutely relevant and devastating in its critique. Anyway, so I don't feel like I really have anything new to say about what's wrong with feminism, except that what I have tried to do in a lot of the Fiamengo files is show the direct relationship between radical feminism in the university as it's been developed and contemporary examples of feminism gone mad and its very damaging impacts on men. And especially the way in which what started off as kind of pie in the sky theories developed in the rarefied atmosphere of academia actually became reality and went mainstream and are now generally accepted ideas about the world. And so that's what I'm going to do. In one of my Fiamengo files, for instance, one of my favorite ones, actually, I talk about the idea of the male gaze, which started as a theory in cinema studies and is now generally taken to be true, that women are damaged by the male gaze, that it has some kind of power, that the entire world is structured around this predatory and oppressive gaze. And you get examples of women complaining to the police about men who they feel look at them inappropriately, and the police actually follow up. So what had seemed kind of just an interesting, intriguing, provocative idea now has material consequences for ordinary people who know nothing about the theory and never thought it would affect them. So that's what I'm going to try to do in each of the chapters, is link these bizarre theories to a specific theorist or school of feminism, and then show how they get played out in real life now in 2017.
Some of this nonsense has metastasized even in legislation. For
Of
instance,
course.
in France, as of 2015, if I recall correctly, I remember covering this on one of my Voice of Europe podcasts with a Voice for Men. Now, basically, the law in France is if a woman says you looked at her and she felt unsafe, that means a crime has been committed. No evidence is necessary, even if you
Mhm.
have video proof that you never touched her. You probably were like 50 meters away from her. That still doesn't matter. If she felt unsafe, that means that a crime has been committed, and the punishment for this crime is nowhere near as light as one might expect. It goes up with a fine of up to 30,000 euros. That's 40,000 US dollars. That's the uh, annual net wage of a very well-paid worker in France. And it can go even as high as to up to 2 years in jail. So it's not a joke.
Yeah, I
These kinds
remember
of.
your coverage of that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, exactly. Of that, that's very much the case. And um, it what can you say about it? It's a kind of madness, and yet it is being formulated into policy in all sorts of Western European as well as North American countries. And I know that you were interested in talking a bit about Bill C-16 in Canada. It's another example
We'll
of,
get to that.
yeah, okay, we'll go ahead. But yeah, exactly. I mean, these things um, do make their way into legislation. So just because an ordinary person isn't interested in the absurdities of feminist theory doesn't mean that feminist theory isn't interested in him. And yeah, to think that we are going to beat a generation of men into submission through these very punitive fines and threats of jail terms sounds like something out of a totalitarian country, but it is all too real in many cases.
Yeah, and it is totalitarian.
Of
Though
course.
I wanted to dwell a bit more about your point that there is nothing new that you can say. And to that effect, I would direct everyone to remember the book The Fraud of Feminism by Belfort Bax, a Marxist, by the way, who wrote the book 104 years ago in 1913. Now, with the exception of certain segments of certain chapters of that book, almost all of the book, that at least 80% of the book, sounds like it was written 2 weeks ago, quite
Right,
frankly.
that's amazing. I don't know that book. Thank you for bringing it to my attention. I'll look it up.
Yeah,
Yeah.
The Fraud of Feminism by Ernest L. Belfort Bax, a British Marxist who eventually, he slowly backed away from Marxism, but he was basically documenting the infiltration of feminism within left-wing movements, which is pretty
Hmm.
much the same thing as Mrs. Erin Pitti has been explaining for decades
Yeah.
now.
Hmm.
That basically the women of the left said, okay, from now on, the enemy is no longer capitalism or
Yes.
factory owners or whatnot. The enemy is men, is patriarchy. Well, basically, that phenomenon is nowhere near as new. Now, in Britain, it became more in policy in a way once the Maoists infiltrated, but the whole tendency is at least 100 years old, probably even older than that. Again, Belfort Bax was writing about it in 1913 with examples of cases of judicial feminist activism in Britain going as back as 1880s, 1870s. He was an attorney before he became a political activist, so he had a lot of knowledge of what was going on inside the courts, and it's amazing when you hear about it. Um, and the fact that it sounds like it was written 2 weeks ago pretty much drives
Yeah.
the point home that there's really nothing new that you can say about feminism.
No.
Nevertheless, people like
Yeah.
Belfort Box and many others throughout the 20s and 30s and 40s have been talking about these things with little to no success until roughly 10 years ago, basically. Around 2007, was still Men's News Daily and then A Voice for Men. Most of these things blew off now, within the last decade. Uh, in the 1990s, talking about these things was a very niched conversation
Hmm.
amongst a very, very tiny amount of people, not necessarily academics, but people acquainted with all of these notions.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it has blown off, which is great in a way. In another way, well, probably one of the reasons this conversation has blown off is because it has become unbearable even for the people who really didn't care. As you said, just because you don't care about these things doesn't mean they don't care about you. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
this is what I keep telling to people. Just because you don't like an ideological war and you're not interested in it doesn't mean the war isn't interested in you.
Mm-hmm.
So speaking of ideological wars, let's talk about two new things coming out of Canada. First of all, the Islamophobia
Oh yeah.
motion,
Mm-hmm.
and then Bill C-16, of course. So tell me about the Islamophobia motion. As I understand it doesn't necessarily have uh, legal effects yet. It's just
Yes.
a
Mm-hmm.
statement of intent, I guess, of the
Yeah.
parliament, that they in the future they would like to punish people like me who say that Islam might be cancer sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and that's of course what the proponents of the motion have repeated ad nauseum, that this is merely a motion. It has no legally binding force. It is merely an expression of concern and desire to study the matter of so-called Islamophobia in Canada. But we all know which way this is going to go. There is going to be a period of study, and it's going to be found that Islamophobic attacks are on the increase in Canada, that there is a real cause for concern. Of course, that this is an irrational fear, that it must be countered. Of course, it won't be countered by reducing immigration from, Muslim majority countries. It won't be countered by taking steps in Canadian society to ensure that Muslim immigrants adhere to the law and embrace Canadian values. It will be countered through fines and threats of jail terms for anyone who dares to, raise the issue of the problems that occur when Muslims form a significant minority of any population. So yeah, it's very, very worrisome. Again, it's not new. This is something that the various human rights tribunals in Canadian provinces have been interested in for a long time. There have already been many fines levied against people like, famous cases like Mark Steyn and Ezra Levant, who have been fined for saying things. Mark Steyn's case, well, he wasn't fined. His paper, Maclean's magazine that he wrote in, was sued. And in fact, they defeated the lawsuit, but Maclean's stopped publishing articles critical of Islam. And for anyone who's read that article that Mark Steyn wrote, he was mostly quoting from imams themselves and their plans to Islamize Canada and to bring in aspects of Sharia law in our country. And, so it's fine for them to say it. They're never attacked for hate speech, but he was attacked for quoting them. And of course, it only takes one lawsuit of that sort to make most publications very wary of ever raising the subject again. So it's an extremely effective method for shutting people up. Whether it reduces Islamophobia, of course, it probably increases Islamophobia. It certainly makes people a lot more resentful and suspicious and bigoted, I suppose. It's something that the president of my university, Jacques Frémont, who was the former head of the Quebec Human Rights Tribunal, was extremely enthusiastic about. They have a policy in which someone can be fined up to 200,000 Canadian dollars for a repeated act of Islamophobia. I mean, it's astounding. So, to think that isn't going to be the outcome of this period of investigation and study. And of course, it all depends on which groups the government allies itself with in order to conduct these studies. And it's very likely that it will ally itself with the most radicalized elements in Canadian society, organizations such as the National Council of Canadian Muslims, who are always finding more and more evidence that Canadian society is just rife with the most vicious hatred of Muslims imaginable. So I expect that we're going that way, and that there already is. I mean, it doesn't matter in a way. There already is a chill on speech. People are afraid to say anything about Muslims and about the Islamicization of Canada. And this will simply codify it further.
Yeah, and especially it's true in Mark Stein's case, the trial, the process is the punishment. I mean, yeah, sure,
Sure,
eventually he was found not guilty, or at the very least he didn't lose the trial.
Yeah.
But the ordeal of going through 1 or 2 years through those social justice tribunals or human rights tribunals, the ordeal itself is big enough to basically chill the speech of everyone else over the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the humiliation of it, the waste of one's time and energy, the knowledge that one is appearing before a body that has already decided you're likely guilty of something, you know, that you're having to stand before a bunch of radical social justice warriors who are just so happy to display their own moral purity by punishing you for your wrong thought. All of that, even if it doesn't result in a fine, is enough to make most people think it's just not worth it. Anyone who has somebody like Mark Stein, think of the things he could be doing with his time. He's a brilliant man, interested in all sorts of things, and he writing constantly, making music, doing his podcasts, all of that, to spend years of his life worrying about some charge by a crazy imam, and to have to prove his innocence to a bunch of people who have already made up their minds that anyone who objects must have something wrong with them. It's just ludicrous. I mean, I myself am appearing before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. It's probably in the fall now. This has already been going on for a year and a half. For not such a serious thing, I'm not facing, I don't believe, serious disciplinary action or a major fine. I don't know what I'm facing. That's part of the delight of these tribunals, that you really have no idea what the punishment might be, because it can be anything they decide. But just thinking about it, it takes up so much of your mental energy that creative people, or people have lots going on in their lives, would rather be spending, rightfully so, on other things. And so even if you think you're probably not going to be found guilty or punished horrifically, the process is deeply humiliating and off-putting, I have to say. It's made me feel like my country is not my country anymore. To think that a ridiculous claim could be brought before me and taken seriously, to the extent that I'm going to have to spend a number of days of my life trying to defend myself against a flimsy charge. It makes me feel like I just want to get out of this country altogether. I want to have nothing to do with it. If there was somewhere else that my husband and I could go to, we would be gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is what usually the defenders of such legislation and such motions tend to say. Oh, look, nobody was actually fined for Islamophobia, or nobody was actually fined or punished or under this or that, or very few people have, and there's usually quote-unquote extreme cases and whatnot. Now, first of all, I would argue that even the extreme cases should be left alone, because I'm a free speech absolutist. But other than that, the process itself, how many people were prosecuted under a certain kind of stupid legislation, or I don't know, politically motivated legislation, I guess I should say. That's what makes the difference, because the punishment is big enough just to go there. And as you said, you are going to go in front of I think it's called the Social Justice Tribunal, the one that you're going to appear in front of.
Mine is specifically the Human Rights Tribunal, but the umbrella organization that covers it and various other tribunals is called Social Justice Tribunals of Ontario. It's unbelievable.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right. Speaking of progression, let's dwell a bit on Bill C-16 as well. This one is also a result of what we're probably going to see with Islamophobia too, because this thing of gender expression has been in certain motions of the parliament for years now.
Yeah.
And Bill C-16 is basically the end of that process. It first starts with something minuscule. Oh, it doesn't produce legal effects. Don't worry. Why are you being such a fanatic and whatnot? And then it eventually metastasizes itself into a bill, which is Bill C-16. So what is Bill C-16? for the people who don't watch Jordan Peterson. Basically.
Yeah, I'm sure most of your viewers probably do already know, but probably know better than I do. But Bill C-16 essentially adds gender identity and gender expression as prohibited grounds of discrimination to the Canadian Human Rights Code and to the Canadian Criminal Code. So it adds them as prohibited grounds of discrimination. And so that means that you can be charged with a hate crime if you discriminate against somebody on those grounds, or you can be found to have contravened the Human Rights Code and therefore be subject to some sort of prosecution under one of the human rights tribunals. And as Jordan Peterson has brilliantly articulated, the definition of what those things are is itself so astoundingly confused and incoherent and vague and garbled that it and not only is worrisome in terms of how one might be punished for it, but is worrisome in terms of the thinking of our legislators. I mean, it's amazing. The legislation declares that gender identity has nothing to do with biological sex, that it is a free-floating, aspect of one's felt or lived experience, that it can change, that it is entirely dependent on the individual's subjective experience, and that therefore the entire Canadian populace is subject to the whims of certain individuals in terms of how they identify gender-wise. So yeah, it's astounding legislation. It has become become a reality. Like just a few years ago, it was this very esoteric, arcane idea, and now it is something that one has to take very seriously, or one faces job loss or discipline or fines or whatever it happens to be. This too is a case of something that goes back to extremely abstruse theoretical developments from the early 1990s. It's hard to say where it starts exactly. I think it started with Judith Butler. I'm actually going to quote from her in my upcoming Fiamengo file, in her book Gender Trouble, where I think she was really the first person to most emphatically make the case, and she makes it in an entirely illogical way. She starts with a couple of claims about the fact that biological sex, which ultimately she doesn't believe in either, but she starts with the claim that biological sex is interpreted by culture, which everybody can agree with. Of course, if you go to Papua New Guinea and observe the indigenous peoples there, how they interpret gender, yeah, it's different from how it's interpreted in Norway or from how it's interpreted in China. Yeah, of course, nobody would disagree with that. But so she starts from that premise, which is inarguable, that biological sex becomes gender and is interpreted by culture. She says that the logical extension of that is that there is absolutely no relationship between biological sex and gender, so that gender is something that culture can construct completely divorced, from biology, and the two don't follow. But
Under this line of thinking, that would mean a man from Norway couldn't tell a man from Papua New Guinea or a man from China, which is absurd.
Right. Exactly so. Yes, exactly so. And
really?
but she makes that claim, and she says that that's the logical extension. And that was kind of course, she develops it in a seemingly very sophisticated way in the entire book, and in follow-up books, that she developed this idea that gender is a performance, that we all perform our genders. And I mean, she's a lot more sophisticated in speaking about these things than I am. But the idea, I don't think anybody really, often with these theories, nobody really believed them, what they say literally. And if you question people in 1993 who were starting to develop these ideas, they would have agreed with you that, yeah, of course you can tell. A man from Norway who goes to Papua New Guinea can see who are the men and who are the women. But people loved the idea. It was an extremely attractive idea, and it developed, and now it's going to become Canadian law.
See, this is why there is a book written in the 40s, I think in 43, I forget the author. The book is called Ideas Have Consequences. And
Yeah.
it basically documents the infiltration of leftist thought within the US government, general thought and general atmosphere. And this was written in 1943, but then again, most of the book sounds like it was written 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
For the same thing. I read it a few years back. That's why I don't remember the author. But anyway, the book is called Ideas Have Consequences.
My husband has it. He would be able to tell you the author. Yeah.
Yeah, bibliography for the audience, basically. I don't know what to say. What I do know is that all this thing sounds like Tumblr wrote its own legislation. I mean, 2 years ago or 3 years ago, it was this running joke, especially with Swedish non-feminists, that if Tumblr was a country, Sweden would be that country. Now I'm not so sure anymore. I think if Tumblr was a country, Canada would be that country. I mean, not even Sweden has this kind of absurd thing.
It will soon. It will soon, I'm sure.
I don't think so. I don't think so. I don't think so. There is some marginally good news coming out of Sweden. Now, of course, the academia is full insane. I'm going to give an example very soon in a few minutes. But the rest of the society, the corridor of opinion seems to have just a little bit widened, which would be the first time in the last 20 years when this has happened. It is no longer the case. Most of these absurdities are starting to go back into the underground. They're no longer on the front page. But nevertheless, Canada is definitely a first in this one.
Yeah.
Sweden definitely doesn't have these kinds of legislation, but still, and I don't know, how do you beat these kinds of things? I mean, what Jordan Peterson is doing is absolutely fantastic, explaining why, where this is coming from, why postmodernism is cancer, why one should fight postmodernism and whatnot. But on a more general fashion, how do you fight these things?
Yeah, you're talking to the wrong person when it comes to that, because I'm not really very hopeful. I just think the radical left is so effective in the way in which it advances its agenda. And as you say, when you read back in history, you see that these ideas were already percolating in the late 19th century. And they just keep on, and they never stop. They're like Islam in that way, they just keep on advancing, and even if they're pushed back, they'll keep on, and they are very patient. And leftist ideas are incredibly attractive, I think. They and even to people that they aren't attractive to, the way in which they're advanced somehow always wrong foots the majority of the opposition, so that we end up feeling uncomfortable and apologetic and uncertain, even as we're trying to put forward our claims for why we disagree with a particular policy or practice or whatever idea. And I've spoken to so many people, smart people, people who are sort of on the conservative side of things, or at least don't see themselves as social justice warriors, and their attitude is often, oh well, so what, it's not such a big deal. I'm not willing to die on this hill. I hear that a lot, and I understand that. I mean, there are a lot of hills I'm not willing to die on either, and the left always makes it a matter of dying on a hill. Somehow they can whip up this incredible furor. They claim to speak for all of these victims whose rage they mobilize. And so it is going to be a case of you're dying on the hill. And most people who have families or have careers or have things they want to accomplish in life just say to themselves, it's easier to go along on this one thing. And actually, I can sort of see their point. Why should this particular transgendered person be humiliated in the workplace, or, whatever. I want to be kind to people. I want to be generous. I want to exercise charity. And so you do end up going along. And then incrementally, the range of opinions that you're allowed to have, or the degree to which you're allowed to determine your own life or determine what your family looks like or what your children are taught, it just keeps getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And before you know it, there's a whole range of things that you simply can't say or hope for. And I don't know. I mean, Jordan Peterson, in a way, you sort of think, well, why isn't every professor like Jordan Peterson? Or at least why aren't there 50 of him in Canada and 500 in the United States, which is 10 times as large? And there aren't. And Jordan Peterson himself would say he gets so many emails, and I get them too, from people who say, I work in the university, I'm sickened by the degree to which radical Marxist theory has totally taken over, in which the most vicious and intolerant elements of the left rule the day, and yet I dare not say anything because I don't have tenure yet, or I just got tenure, and I dare not because my career will be ruined, or it'll just be impossible to teach. I really love teaching. I want to keep doing it. I can't stand the thought that every single one of my colleagues will no longer speak to me. I don't want to deal with the student backlash. I don't want to deal with the bad evaluations. I don't want to have my administration coming down on me. There's always a reason not to say anything. And
excuse me for interrupting you, but there are always reasons not to do the right thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I mean, just saying. I mean, there are always reasons not to do the right thing. For instance, when I decided to go public on all of these things, I took some measures. I moved my assets away from where any politically correct government can reach to me, and basically took some steps to avoid any serious consequences. So I understand the consequences, but nevertheless, doing the right thing should be the moral imperative. So it basically, what you're describing is basically the success of the left, not to necessarily to impose its ideas, but to demoralize its opposition.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
As Yuri Bezmenov used to say 30 years ago. Also in Canada, by the way. Basically, he was talking about demoralization, which is far more important of a step in leftist subversion than anything else, basically, because you can't convince everyone or even most people of your ideas. But if you can demoralize most people, that's as good as convincing them.
Yeah. And I think that is what the left has been so brilliant at doing, just as Islam is brilliant at doing it. There's always a two-pronged attack, that you have the radicals who are willing to blow up buildings and kill people, and then you have the others who keep insisting that if simply the society accommodates these various demands, there may be fewer buildings blown up and fewer people killed. The left sort of does something similar. The most radicals are like the students at Evergreen College in Washington, who I'm sure you've been following, who surround a professor and scream at him because he won't leave on the day when whites are supposed to absent themselves from campus. And so they scream and demand that he be fired or disciplined in some way. And he sounds like almost as if they've got the president of the university convinced that he should go along with their demands. And so they're the terrorists, but then there are a whole bunch of other people who support them ideologically and who suggest that actually there's much of truth in they've got a reason for their anger, etc. And and those who stand out against it are demoralized. And I think human beings are social beings. Most of us really want to be approved by our peers, and so to not feel one has a comfortable home with the people one has to work with every day, or the community that one lives in, where one wants to have positive interactions with people. I think for a huge majority of people, that alone is enough to prevent them from taking the risks, even if their career isn't on the line. And if it is, of course, that just magnifies the problem. I don't know, like, why did Andrew Breitbart drop dead? Some people think he was killed, but the constant negativity of, even if you thrive on that, as he obviously did, a lot of people don't thrive on it, and it can really have psychological and physical consequences. I find now I'm like I can't listen to most mainstream news, and stories people send me of yet another atrocity, and I feel I should read about them because, you know, it's part of what I do. I need to be a little bit informed about this stuff, and yet often I can't because I find it just too much. You feel like the whole world has gone crazy, and there's no point in even trying to combat it because it's just too big for a few valiant souls to speak against. So I think that's why, you know, and so people just decide, I'm just going to put my head down. I'm going to find pleasure in other things. I'm going to become an internal exile, as people did, you know, during the Soviet era. You know, they just give up.
Yeah. Uh, what I always say is that we kind of do need, not just for conservatives, but generally for the non-left, we really do need our own school in which to school next generations of pushbackers, not necessarily activists, but pushbackers. And the first lesson in every class should be stop bloody apologizing. You don't apologize to these people ever at all for any
No,
reason. Oh, you feel hurt?
absolutely.
Fuck your feelings. Tough. Uh, and you know, it sounds very harsh when you put it this way, but from where I'm coming from, fuck your feelings is an absolute necessity. Uh,
Absolutely.
I mean, many people have had their feelings hurt in the 1989 revolution, where when communism, at least the official political communism, was swept away, because generally that was a whole process. But at least the official party was swept away. A lot of people have had their feelings hurt, and I don't think anyone ever gave a damn, because you don't have to. You don't apologize to these people because you don't have to. Did
Yeah,
they
well,
did they apologize to anyone for all of the
no,
people that they imprisoned, that they sent into gulags, that they sent into forced labor? They, of course, they didn't.
no, no. And, you know, a conservative or non-leftist leaning student today on a university campus probably has his feelings hurt every day. I'm offended by something, disturbed by something, disheartened by something every day I'm walking around on campus. That's just part of being, you know, an adult, is learning to deal with that. And so, yeah, I agree with you about the apologizing, and also about, you know, in this school, which I wish would come into being, psychological survival is one of the things that would need to be taught, I think, because I just think a lot of people find it just too bloody difficult, too tiring, too disheartening to go on day after day, year after year, fighting this fight, being told that he or she is a hater, is a bigot, is intolerant, you know, wants to destroy people, you know, denies people the right to exist, all the kinds of things that the radical left throws at them. It's very hard to hear even a bit of that and not internalize it to some extent.
I think it is a case of a cyclical thing. You know, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men.
Weak, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Men in the sense in general, as in people. So it kind of does look like this. I mean, in the intermarium, in the eastern, in the former Eastern Bloc, in Eastern Europe, there were very hard times way up until the mid 90s, basically. So it created an entire generation of relatively strong men, at least psychologically. I mean, for instance, when someone tells me that I'm an intolerant or I'm a hater, I'm like, yeah, okay, so. And that infuriates, especially when, you know, leftist ideologues from Scandinavia travel around here, and they realize that their spells, basically their mantras, simply don't work with Eastern European conservatives, because they're like, who gives a shit what you think?
Yeah. No, I'm coming around to that too. But the difficulty of coming around to that is enough to put a lot of people off, I think.
Speaking of
Yeah, those.
Scandinavian insanity, because I mentioned that the academe is still going full insane. A friend of mine who will be helping me with the Swedish trip sent me this link. The University of Linköping is organizing a conference, basically tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, June the 1st and June the 2nd, on speed dating. Hold on, let me say. Speed dating with plants while doing yoga. And this is the same university that funded several hundreds of pages of research on sexism in train stations and bus terminals. How the hell do you fight these kinds of things? I mean, it sounds straight out of the Onion. I mean, if he hadn't provided me, he provided me a link of a right-leaning publication, Friatid, reporting on this, and I'm like, come on, Friatid must be joking. And he's like, no, here's the official university link with the conference. And how do you fight these things?
Only through satire, I think. But we get to that point where you can't satirize because the reality is so crazy that it's beyond satire. Yeah,
The left has just killed satire.
It's true, absolutely. Yeah, it's we have to find different ways to mock and revile and ridicule. A friend of mine who often sends me interesting things recently sent me a study on, he called it the intersectional feminist squirrel. It's going to be one of my upcoming Fiamengo files because, and it really, it makes the conceptual penis as a social construct look really tame, but it's a real article in the domain of gender and geographical studies or something like that. And basically,
sorry, come again. Gender and
geography. Basically, it's a kind of geography studies kind of article where this woman is looking at, but it's really media discourse analysis. She's looking at reports about a certain kind of squirrel that is proliferating in a certain part of California. And she uses these reports, and they're just sort of popular news reporting. She reads them as, betraying certain kinds of assumptions and preconceptions about larger social issues. So if someone is worried and writes a report about this squirrel that's taking over the area normally occupied by other species of squirrels, this exposes, fears about invasion narratives, invasion threat, fears of immigrants, and this kind of thing. She uses a feminist lens. She looks at the kinds of things that are said about the squirrels and how these map onto discourses about women and inappropriate sexuality or inappropriate gender expression. And this is a serious article. It's even weirder than the feminist glaciology article that everybody was laughing at.
I was about to bring that up. I mean, really?
Yeah. I mean, you can always find these kinds of things. They're everywhere. I mean, in fact, if I had unlimited time, I think it would be really worthwhile, maybe somebody is doing this, to go through the various journals. There's so many of them now, the women's studies and the masculinity journals. And
sorry for interrupting. There is a Twitter account. It's called The Real Peer Review.
Oh, I've heard about that. Yeah.
And they tweet at least once a day, sometimes several times a day, another glimpse of stupidity from some posh academic journal. And although at first they started with debunking, several insane claims made by some creationist scientists, they eventually ended up using most of their time on feminist studies and masculinity studies and whatnot, because it's just so much insanity. I mean, the creationists cannot even begin to dream about producing such a huge amount of nonsense daily. They just can't. There aren't so many of them.
No, there aren't as many, and a lot of them are actually, I think, I don't read that stuff, but as far as I understand it, they are actually trying to use the tools of reason, evidence to prove their case. Whereas those who work in gender studies they
automatically refuse evidence.
Yeah, they begin from the present.
So increasingly.
Sure. I mean, reason itself is not a patriarchal plot exactly, but it's a masculinist, form of thinking or whatever, and it in itself is damaging, and so they can reject it altogether without any problem. So yeah, I mean the number of journals now. The number of people who begin from the claim that all gender is a social construct, and therefore, now we're going to start in on our reconstruction to create our utopia. and the number who begin from this premise, like the intersectional feminist squirrel paper. It wasn't called that, but that everything, that like there's such a vast conspiracy that everything in our world can be read as evidence of this deep-seated homophobia, racism, white supremacism, toxic, masculine, predatory, whatever. And they really believe this stuff. And yeah, so what do you do with it? I mean, I don't know. How do you counter? And it's not just those professors, who number in the hundreds of thousands, but it's the students that are maybe not thoroughly indoctrinated. The thing that I always fall back on to give myself comfort is that a lot of these students don't really understand. They're not that interested. They just want to pass the courses, so they don't really take it all in. A lot of them, have a very vague idea of what is actually being taught to them, but they pick up the general idea, and then they go out into the workplace. And so we've had 2 generations of students, certainly in North America, who actually now believe that gender is a social construct. And they can't necessarily defend that platform, but they don't see it as ridiculous. And even highly intelligent, well-educated people think, oh yeah, well, there's a grain of truth in it, they'll say, to a certain extent. And so it does have a massive impact ultimately. And how do you counter that? I don't know. I mean, really, it's maybe the society just has to collapse. I'm really not sure.
Yeah, and in certain portions of North America, surely the general society that would have countered that has pretty much gone, has disappeared. Because as I was saying in the London conference, when someone asked me about this, whether there is such insanity in the academia in Romania, and I said yes, there is, but even the students who end up being true believers in this nonsense, once they go out of that university, they deprogram themselves within the first 6 months, because the reality that they learned about in university simply doesn't exist around them. So if they want to keep their faith, and I'm going to use this kind of language, if they want to keep their faith, they really have 3 options. One of them is to emigrate in a place that actually has this kind of faith. The second is to seclude themselves from the rest of the society, which is kind of difficult. And third, to deprogram themselves. And most of them end up being deprogrammed. I've actually been following a few of these teenagers. They go into university, normal people. They do one of these feminist degrees, whatever, for 3 years or 4 years. They come out from there true believers, and then 6 to 8 months later, they're again normal people, just like they were when they got into the university. Because if the surrounding society simply doesn't want and outright refuses to indulge such nonsense, it just doesn't hold up. However, this kind of thing is being indulged in, at least in certain portions of North America. I'm thinking here, I don't know, maybe San Francisco or most of Southern California for sure. Maybe the Canadian capital in Ottawa, but definitely not, I would say, in I don't know, in rural Texas or rural Louisiana. I think there things are still the way they used to be 40, 50, 60 years ago. At least when it comes.
I think so. I mean, my husband and I live now south of Ottawa in a region called the Thousand Islands, and we encounter tradespeople and shop owners and people who have farms and retirees as well. This is a rural area, and we encounter a lot of common sense that sometimes restores our hope that there are people who can think clearly, and most of them vote conservative. They're appalled at what both the provincial and federal governments are doing. And so, there are still people who are not affected by this ideological indoctrination, but I don't know. I mean, it's not only in the universities in Canada, it's in our public broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. it's infiltrated certainly into the legal system, into the police forces, and
even primary schools.
in primary schools. Absolutely, we have friends who teach music in the primary school system, and they're appalled by the hardcore indoctrination that's going on there in anti-white and anti-male sentiment. It's just amazing.
Now, this seems to be quite a tendency. I mean, at first I thought that maybe this particular set of ideas tended to be somewhat more attractive than usual. That's what I used to believe 10 years ago. But now I've come to believe that it's pretty much a general tendency. The intellectuals seem to be attracted to totalitarian ideas. I mean, most of the intellectuals of the 20s and 30s were fascists. They were that was the progressive thing to do in the 20s and 30s. Fascism was the progressive thing to do. So it is a tendency that has been going on for at the very least 100 years, probably even more than that. Although if you even go back as far back as Plato and ancient Greece, there has always been a tendency in intellectuals to buy whole line and sinker. I forget the expression, but basically to buy entirely into certain aspects or sometimes entirely into totalitarian ideologies. Most intellectuals seem to fall for this. Why do you think this is happening?
Well, I think this is simplistic in a way, but I think most intellectuals are repulsed by ordinary people because they see themselves as intellectually superior to them, and they are in a certain very narrow way they are. So they're smarter, and so they have these dreams of a more perfect society, in which, of course, they would play a key role in bringing about that perfection. And I think they are very attracted to absolutist societies that promise some kind of utopian unity and strength, and that would be governed by an elite that would tell the masses what to think and how to behave in a way much better than the base, selfish, petty manner in which ordinary people want to live their lives. And so that tends to mean that they are very attracted to totalitarian systems. That's all I can really say. And it's made me think, listening to Jordan Peterson talk about his upbringing, which was not, he isn't like so many intellectuals are. He's not the son of intellectuals. So many of them, they are a separate class. And I too, my parents are not intellectuals. They didn't attend university. They're not the least bit interested. In fact, they have a certain kind of contempt for intellectuals. And I think that's partly why I was able to reject that mindset. It is a mindset of superiority, of class superiority.
That's a very, very good point. I never heard it before, but now that I think of it, Thomas Sowell also grew up in Harlem in abject poverty. So Thomas Sowell is another dissenting intellectual, especially on issues like class, race, and especially economics. Economics.
He's amazing. Again, I mean, he's been saying it all for how many decades? You can find those old videos where he was just a young guy debunking notions of the pay gap and all of that. Yeah, I mean, he's brilliant. Exactly, good example.
Yeah, and again, bibliography for the audience: Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Race; Thomas Sowell, Intellectuals and Society; and Thomas Sowell, War, Poverty, and Politics. Read it. Okay, so Thomas Sowell is another example, and again, he didn't have this kind of intellectual upbringing, as you say. And I think if we dig long enough, almost all of the dissenting intellectuals have this kind of upbringing. That is to say, they grew up in a normal family with normal people, as opposed to people in their ivory towers.
Yeah, I really think there's something to that. And I was very aware of that when I first went to graduate school. I noticed that most of my peers were themselves the children either of professors or, high-level lawyers or diplomats. I mean, they're completely overrepresented. Most lower middle class and well, especially, I mean, I would call myself lower middle class, and I stuck out like a sore thumb, and I felt my difference. And I'm now really thankful for that because I think it grounded me. So certainly there are some working class people who end up in academia who carry their former working class allegiance as their sort of badge of honor. Then they turn it into a kind of intellectual radicalism. But most people in the academy are themselves the sons and daughters of academics or other elites. And I think that's a lot of what motivates them. They believe they are a superior class who should be able to dictate how others live. And they like the idea of a strong man, or at least a strong state, to control the unruly masses.
All right, two more topics and then we can wrap this up, both of them on culture. Last time we spoke, as I was saying in the intro, Trump was just at best a distant hope. Now we're over 4 months into the Trump administration. I don't think any of us could could have imagined that we'll be speaking about the Trump administration last time we spoke.
Yeah.
What's your take on on how things are rolling so far, especially on the culture, less so on general policy?
Yeah, well, I must admit that the level of Trump derangement syndrome that went into play immediately upon his inauguration was so repulsive to me that I have not been able to follow very closely what's been going on. I mean, every time I open up any online news forum, there's something, Trump, calls for Trump's impeachment. Trump proves yet again that he is an absolute moron. Trump proves yet again that he's the stupidest president ever. Yet another celebrity calls for Trump to be assassinated, and so on and so on. So I found it all really just a complete turnoff. But the fact that he is there expresses something profound about the disenchantment of so many people, the anger, the fed-uppedness of so many people with the establishment. So to that extent, even if he accomplishes very little, and I think, the possibility of what he's going to do with the Supreme Court could be very profound, very important for decades to come. But just in terms of what he represents, the pushback against political correctness, the desire on the part of a significant percentage of the population to see a change and to see a different way of speaking about all of these issues, a rejection of all the parameters on polite discourse. I find inspiring. I was so excited when he was elected in November. So yeah, to that extent, he represents a radical change in the cultural climate, and that does give me hope.
Yeah, in the end, Milo Yiannopoulos has been proven right in the sense that, well, very few people actually voted for him on policy. A significant, maybe not a majority, but a significant minority of his voters ended up voting for him on cultural reasons. Just to provide a proverbial and well-deserved kick in the teeth to all of these sanctimonious pricks in the cathedral media and in universities and in schools and everywhere else where where you get told how to live and how not to live and what to say and what not to say. Eventually, enough Americans have had enough of this.
The heartland Americans, the white working class that have been the backbone of the American economy, that keep that country running, and are so fed up with being condescended to by coastal elites. That is what he represents, and that I found very satisfying to see, because I really feel for those people.
Now, again, even if Trump makes a lot of mistakes by the end of his term, he did
Hmm.
what he already, by virtue of breathing in the White House, he
Yes.
did something that we never hoped it would be possible 3 or 4 years ago. Just this morning, Facebook reminded me that 4 years ago today, on May the 31st, I was talking about drugging kids in schools and how
Hmm.
the cathedral media covers that up. Um, 4 years now since I made that episode, long time ago already. Now you see the cathedral media being exposed for what it is, which is
Yeah.
the media arm, the media propaganda arm of the Democratic Party,
Yeah.
essentially, or what I think Mark Stein calls it, the Democrat media complex.
Yeah.
Which is a fantastic name. It's either Mark Stein or Charles Murray. But anyway, speaking of which, I should look up into the upbringing of Charles Murray. Maybe he's working
Hmm.
class too.
Yeah, he
um,
doesn't sound like it, but I can't interpret British accents. He sounds very posh to me, but that could be wrong. Hmm.
No, not Douglas Murray, not the British one. Charles Murray, the American one, the one who wrote
Oh,
"Coming
Charles
Apart."
Murray.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, the author
Right.
of
Very
"Coming
good.
Apart." Yeah. Anyway, he already did this because I started receiving even emails from people that used to that you know several years ago they blocked me on social media, said I'm a loon, I'm a radical, I'm a fanatic, and whatnot. And now
Mhm.
they unblocked me and befriended me and started speaking to me and said, I thought you were a loon when you said that the entirety of the media is insane. But now I look at them how they treat Trump, and I'm like, holy shit, Bulsan was right.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
He
Yeah.
exposed that single-handedly
He
just by
did.
breathing.
Yeah, he did. Absolutely. Yeah, and he was a conduit for the expression of pent up frustration and disenchantment and outrage and disbelief in the party line that the mainstream media was pumping out for so many years. So yeah, in that way, you're right. I think his election has been really significant, no matter what happens.
Yeah, and it seems that the media doesn't even want to learn. I mean, recently there was a
No.
Harvard study that proved that the media offers an overwhelmingly negative coverage of Trump, even when he doesn't deserve it. It's so overwhelmingly negative that it makes George W. Bush look like a fantastic figure in
Hmm.
comparison.
Yeah.
I mean, and they were looking like how a percentage of positive versus negative coverage. And with the exception of Obama, the previous four administrations, I think, got mostly negative coverage, but still it was like 55, 45, 57, 43. But then here along comes Trump with 80 to 20, and on
Hmm.
certain topics like 98% negative coverage. There's
Yeah.
no way you can justify that. Even if you're a partisan for the
Yeah.
Democrat Party, there's no way you can justify that.
Yeah, but
And the
they
people,
do.
and
I mean,
the,
they're stuck. You know, they're in the corner now. They know that they're hemorrhaging readers and viewers. They're never going to get the people they've lost back, and so they're preaching to their, the tiny subculture that feels exactly as they do about Trump. Well, it's not a tiny subculture. They're the significant minority of people who feel exactly that way about Trump. So they're
probably that's why they're
doubling
trying to
down.
control. Probably that's why they're trying to control YouTube now, and they're
Of
trying
course.
to crack
Yeah.
down on alternative media.
Hmm.
All right. One last thing about culture, and then we can wrap this up. On feminism, there have been out two very important films. One in the West, The Red Pill, and one in the East, Martyrs of Marriage in India, that I have reviewed on my channel. Um, these things are starting to make their own impact.
Yeah.
Again, it's something that we could only dream about in
Hmm.
2010 when we were
Yes.
writing. When I was writing articles in 2010 for A Voice for Men, I was thinking, damn, if we could just break the scene with one or two movies like
Yeah.
these, and it sounded like a pipe dream. And here we are now in the current year plus two.
Yeah.
um,
Hmm.
Martyrs of Marriage. I don't know. I hope you'll have the
I
chance to
haven't
watch.
seen it, no, but I know Steve has it up on Studio Brule.
Mhm. Yeah, you should try watching that one. That movie is now already used as for training purposes in academies for magistrates in India. It is literally changing the deep state
Wow.
as we speak.
Yeah.
The red pill, on the other hand, is changing the culture in very fundamental ways. I mean, I've seen people who used to dismiss the entirety of non-feminist speech just 2 years ago, and they're
Mhm.
now all sharing news about the red pill and what they learned, and how they're starting to ask questions to themselves, and they're like, oh my god, what if all those people that we ignored, they actually had a point?
Mhm.
Oh my god,
Yeah.
what if feminism really is cancer?
Mhm.
I mean, the red pill in itself is changing the culture fundamentally,
Yeah.
also in Europe and of course in North America. uh should we expect more of this?
I sure hope so. Yeah, and I think actually we probably can. And I agree with you. You know, I'm always downbeat and pessimistic. But last year when we talked at this time, we didn't know about the red pill. We knew about it, but we hadn't seen it yet, and we were hopeful. And I don't think I could have imagined, if I had thought of my ideal film, what would be the best way to get this message out? It couldn't have been any better than what that is. And I mean, I'm sure you felt when you were watching it, you weren't really learning anything new. You already knew all of this stuff, and but it speaks to that vast majority of people who have accepted feminist assumptions and have accepted the feminist dismissal of anybody who tried to critique or to speak on behalf of men. And the fact that she structures the whole film around her personal journey and talks about her hesitancy in believing it and her sense of conflictedness and the difficulty she had reconciling her feminist principles with what she was hearing from these men. And the fact that she is who she is, such a mild, beautiful, of course, it helps that she's gorgeous and so nice and so soft spoken and non-threatening. I think the film speaks equally to men who have been on the fence or haven't wanted to, confront the fact that things are as bad as some of their friends were telling them they were, who had themselves had a bad experience but didn't realize it was so widespread. But also, of course, really importantly, to all of those women who said feminism was about equality and now have to confront this, told, through the voice of this soft-spoken former feminist. It's incredibly engaging, incredibly impactful, and yeah, it's done better than I thought it would. The protests have backfired and only helped and brought more attention to what might have been a kind of minor film. It might have just sort of disappeared. But because
Mhm.
feminists protested it so vociferously, a lot of people have taken a look, and I think now it's really gaining momentum even more. So I think
Mhm.
it will inspire more such endeavors, and maybe even Cassie J herself will do more work in that area. And I think whether she intended to or not, she's turning into an incredibly important role model for young women interested in making an impact in the culture. I think she's going to turn all sorts of young women away from feminism.
Mhm. Yeah, and this is probably the best aspect of the red pill, that it confronts straight on the narrative of lived experiences,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because it starts with, hello, this is the red pill, this is my lived experience. That's
Yeah.
basically what it is, and then it starts starts to unravel from there.
Yeah.
And this kind of thing, it just confronts the exact assumptions that are could have otherwise seem as impenetrable, basically.
Yeah.
uh, and it does a tremendous job in confronting exactly those assumptions that have been keeping the non-feminist message in check
Yeah.
for decades, or even 100 years, if we're starting counting from Belfort Bax onwards.
Yeah, yeah. No, the significance of it really can't be underestimated. And she was the ideal vehicle, and she chose the ideal structure for that kind of message. If I'd done it, it would have been all wrong. It would have been, I would have approached it differently, and it wouldn't have had the impact. She has a kind of intuitive genius about how to reach ordinary people who have entirely accepted the feminist narrative, and she exposed it for the truly limited and dishonest story that it really is.
Mhm. Yeah, it basically, as a friend of mine says, it's basically a film for normies,
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah.
because it doesn't speak to people like you and I.
No.
We never learned anything. I was delighted to see some of the videos that I edited used in the
Hmm.
video. So obviously, since in some ways both of us have contributed to this film, we definitely didn't learn anything new. But it's definitely a good way of a good way to present things
Yeah.
to the people who had no idea that this thing even exists.
Yeah, no, I know it's totally non-threatening and moving. It approaches the subject emotionally, which is a way that so many women respond. And yeah, it's I mean, a lot of people have critiqued the film, said it didn't deal with the dark side of the men's rights movement, all that kind of thing, but it was perfect in what it did. It made it so difficult for feminists to counter, and of course, by including feminists, none of whom were able to successfully get their message across in the film, she really dealt a body blow to the feminist story.
Yeah, and the feminists can't come up with the excuse that she intentionally chose the most insane feminists. No,
Yeah.
she chose the biggest exponents. I mean, if
Yeah.
Michael Kimmel
Yeah.
is not a big enough of a figure in feminism, then who
Yeah.
the hell is? What the
I
hell
mean,
is a feminist figure if Michael
exactly.
Kimmel is not good enough?
Yeah, Michael Kimmel is the major spokesperson for the unimpeachable male feminist point of view, and he just looked like a fool and a liar.
Mhm. Yeah, this is pretty much a very similar, and I know that at the time they started, neither Cassie J knew Deepika from India, and neither Deepika knew Cassie J. In fact, Deepika had a head start because she was already being booked in TED Talks to talk about these things before she started producing Martyrs of Marriage. But in a way, Martyrs of Marriage pretty much does almost the same thing. It approaches things emotionally, and it is basically made. Uh, for normies. It's not made for men's rights activists, which is good. I mean, I've been yearning for these kinds of things for over a decade now. That people like us from the non-left, generally, because I wouldn't cast Cassie J as a conservative, but
No.
people from the non-left, from the non-insanity circle, which is big. Which is already a big enough circle. People from the non-insanity have failed consistently to make their case using emotions. And the
Mm-hmm.
red pill does just that. It
Yeah.
finally takes the step to where nobody wanted to for many decades. It's like, oh,
Yeah.
we can't go emotionally. That's beneath us. Well,
That's
maybe,
it.
maybe it is beneath us, but we want to win, don't we?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
All right. Then with all of that being said, we've been going on for enough already, 76 minutes. Next
Ah,
time when you're done with the book, right? When Sons of
okay.
Feminism comes out and I get a
Yeah.
chance to read it,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
and then we'll talk about that. We should try to take less than a year between our chats. Wouldn't you agree with that?
Definitely. Mm.
All right.
Okay.
Then
Take
with all of
care.
that being said, thank you again for coming on this show, Professor Fiamengo. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all soon. Cheers.
Bye bye.